It's now time for us to take a look at news stories making headlines around the globe today. Well, as part of Arise News' coronavirus coverage, my colleague Charles Anelagulu spoke to the United Nations Secretary-General Antonio Guterres, who has launched a global call to action and a humanitarian appeal to tackle the pandemic and combat the spread of the disease in the world's most vulnerable countries. As Mr. Guterres put it, COVID-19 is menacing the world of humanity, or the whole of humanity, rather. And so the whole of humanity must fight back. So here he is, speaking exclusively to Arise News.
What is obvious is that until now, we have witnessed different countries with different strategies according to their own capacities. And even if there are very clear guidelines from the World Health Organization, there was not a well-organized global response to coronavirus. And I'm particularly worried because of the countries of the South. So what I believe is that we need to have a coordinated and organized response in which all countries of the world will adopt a strategy based on testing, on tracing, on quarantining those that were detected having had contacts with people infected, and at the same time on the necessary complementary measures of restriction of movement and separation of people. But this needs to be done together, and to do it together, the developed countries must do a massive program of support to the developing countries. The coronavirus started in China, it moved into Europe, into the United States, but now it's moving into Africa, to Latin America, to South Asia. And I'm particularly worried with the African continent. It is absolutely essential, and there was a proposal in the G20 for a special G20 program for Africa. It must be implemented. We must have a massive volume of resources to support the developing world in general, the African continent in particular, to be able to respond to the threat of the virus. And we know how difficult it is for many African countries due to the lack of health systems that are sufficiently powerful, due to the fact that the economy is largely informal, due to the difficulties of controlling the movements of people. So a massive investment must be made by the developed countries in support to the developing world, particularly in support to Africa, to allow for Africa to respond with in an effective way to the virus. If the North does not help the South, we risk to have the spread as a wildfire in the South, and this would be terribly detrimental both to the South and the North. So it's in the enlightened self-interest of developed countries to support the developing world, and Africa in particular, in this moment.
Well, I mean, it doesn't sound, Secretary General, as though you envisage a quick or a reasonably quick recovery from the coronavirus pandemic. I mean, whereas people like President Trump, for example, are predicting that things are going to start getting back to normal in a few weeks' time. But you don't see it that way. Your advice to countries is don't let your guard down.
I think it is clear that depending on the measures that were taken in each country, some countries will be able to suppress the transmission more quickly, others it will take more time. But everybody needs to be careful, because before it is suppressed everywhere, nobody can be sure that the risk has disappeared. And in my opinion, this is going to last for some time, and we need to be prepared for the recovery too. Because we cannot recover just moving back to the same economy we had in the past. It is demonstrated that that economy was extremely vulnerable to shocks like this, as it is vulnerable to climate change. We need to make sure that when we recover building a more resilient society and a more inclusive and sustainable economy. And so, one reason more for international solidarity and one reason more for international coordination.
Now, just talking about the economy, Secretary General, one analyst said the best way to think about this is like a chasm in the economy where the world has suddenly dropped off. I mean, how substantial do you think the bridge should be to get the global economy from one side of that chasm to the other?
I think we need a double-digit percentage of GDP globally in order to be able to address this challenge. By the way, this is more or less what the United States have done when they approved in the Senate a $2 trillion package to support the American economy. And of course, developed countries can do it. And this time it's not to support banks, this is not a financial crisis, it must be to support people and must be to support small and medium-sized businesses, giving money to all those that lose their jobs or that depend on the informal economy that can no longer subsist, or to the businesses that keep people employed. But these that the developed countries can do by themselves.
So there was our colleague last night, Charles Aniagolu, speaking to Antonio Guterres with regards particularly to the pandemic and how it's going to affect Africa. And he made some very key points there on how governments need to take a lot of things more seriously: social distancing, the measures that we need to adopt, public health guidelines and policies that we have to follow. Doctor, what is your take on that extremely robust interview?
Well, first, let's commend the Secretary General of the United Nations, Antonio Guterres, for the leadership that he has been providing, for the articulate manner in which he has been trying to identify key issues for global concern. He's calling for global cooperation. He's calling for global solidarity. One other point that he has made, which you must all note, is that, look, the world needs to come together.
Exactly.
The lesson that we have learned from all of this is that we live in a dysfunctional world. And unless we come together, we join hands together, we may not be able to solve the problem. And as a major leader in the world, is also talking about recovery, looking beyond COVID-19, thinking in terms of lessons that we have learned and how we can turn those lessons into an advantage. And he's saying that, you know, privileged countries need to help those vulnerable countries that are most affected at this time. And in that regard, both in that interview and I think also on his Twitter handle, and he's been very, you know, vocal on his Twitter handle, he's calling for a global ceasefire. Now, by global ceasefire, it means, for example, that countries that have sanctions imposed on them should have those sanctions lifted. Countries like Iran. Syria, like Iran, like Afghanistan, you know, and similar countries like Venezuela, maybe Cuba to some extent, because at this time, the entire world is vulnerable. And it's also asking for the writing off of loans for indebted vulnerable countries who are affected by COVID-19 at this time and who may even be worse affected after, you know, COVID-19 may have passed. And I think the whole point, the big takeaway, is about leadership, about cooperation, about solidarity. And he made a point, you know, and maybe that's the thing that we all should take away, that this is not a financial crisis. This is a humanitarian crisis.
Thank you.
According to the United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres. And we don't need to argue with him on that score.
At all.
Because we've all seen that, look, COVID-19 has changed the way we live, the way we think, the way we relate. And his point about the humanitarian crisis is something that should be taken seriously by the rich helping the poor, by international organizations helping the poor and the vulnerable at this time.
And in his words, he said, if we're not careful, in quotes, it's going to spread like a wildfire in the South.